and we will get started momentarily. Okay, let's get started. Thank you all so very much for joining us. My name is David Halperin. I'm the CEO of Israel Policy Forum. All of us at IPF are relieved to hear that a hostage release deal has been reached, and our hope is that it will be fully implemented, and that ultimately all of those taken hostage on October 7th will return safely to their homes. We're grateful for the diplomatic leadership of the United States in helping to bring about this release, just as we are grateful for the United States' support for Israel's security and its efforts to facilitate regional and international cooperation necessary to address the growing humanitarian needs of the people in Gaza. This is a moment that calls for U.S. leadership. It is a moment that calls for constructive diplomacy, for thoughtful, considered policies to ensure that the current crisis can ultimately become an opportunity upon which the region can rebuild and ultimately find a path toward a more secure, peaceful future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. It's also a moment for Israel Policy Forum. We recognize our responsibility to provide leadership in providing policymakers and community leaders with the credible content and prudent guidance they are seeking to navigate this crisis. As we approach the Thanksgiving holiday, I want to thank all of you on this webinar for all you do to strengthen our work, and extend my special thanks to our board, our network of young professional leaders, and our supporters across the country and beyond. Thank you for your participation, your amplification of our content and messages, for your encouragement, support, and feedback on all we do. I also want to extend my gratitude to my colleagues who are going to be joining us on this webinar today to unpack the latest developments in this hostage deal, and we'll also discuss, of course, what might come next. Last week, I had the opportunity to spend time with all our guests today, and I can say we at IPF are tremendously fortunate to be able to call upon the genuine expertise of our policy team, and I'm grateful for all the work that they do. I want to encourage you all to ask questions as part of today's conversation by typing your questions in the chat. I'll be sure to get to as many as we possibly can in today's conversation. And I believe that we are having some technical difficulties identifying all of our speakers, but hopefully we will bring them in shortly. We will be joined by Neri Zilber, our Israel advisor and host of our podcast, Israel Policy Pod, by the Glazer Foundation Senior Director for Policy Research, Shira Efron, by our Israel Fellow, Nimrod Novik, and of course by our Chief Policy Officer, Michael Koplow. I want to welcome Michael and Nimrod into the line as we hope to have Neri and Shira joining us momentarily. We are having some technical issues, it appears, in getting them to join on the line. So Nimrod, I'm going to actually start with you, which is to give us a sense of what led to this moment. Give us a sense of what ultimately fell into place to enable the announcement late last night, Eastern time, of the deal that we now see as reportedly soon to be implemented.
I'd say that primarily three factors. Two security political ones and one technical. I'll start with the technical. Turns out that given the state of war in Gaza, the location of the Hamas leadership, Sinwar and others, messaging from intermediaries and mediators take between 12 to 24 hours to do a round trip of asking a question and coming with an answer. So that was laid heavy on the pace of negotiations. But more to the point, I'd say that Hamas is under tremendous pressure, was desperate for a brief relief that will have security military implications on its operations, and that's on one end. On the other end, I believe that public pressure on the Israeli government, the public is almost uniformly overwhelming support for the families of the hostages. And under that pressure, the combination that Hamas yielded, our government yielded, and here we are.
Michael, what can you say about the role of the United States in bringing about the announcement?
It's pretty clear that the United States was essential here in a number of ways. First of all, it's safe to say that Israel's military campaign has put a lot of pressure on Hamas, which has led to the hostage release. When you think about the types of deals that were being discussed very early on, where Hamas was insisting no hostages would be released until 6,000 Palestinian prisoners would be released out of Israeli prisons. And you think back to, for instance, the Gilad Shalit deal from 2011, where it was one Israeli for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. We're now in a situation where we have 50 Israeli hostages released for 150 Palestinian prisoners. And so obviously the cost has gone down. I think much of that is due to Israel's military campaign, which would not have been possible without the full backing and support of the United States. Second, when it comes to the negotiations themselves, it's very clear that while Qatar is the intermediary here that can actually deal with Hamas, something that Israel does not do directly, at least officially, and something that the U.S. obviously is not going to do in terms of dealing with Hamas directly. The U.S. is essential to getting Qatar on board, given the influence that the U.S. government has over the Qataris. And there's also been reporting today about a special team that the U.S. formed within the NSC to basically get a hostage deal from day one. And so I think without the U.S. really pressing here, giving the space for Israel to keep its military campaign going, dealing with the Qataris, making sure that it was working on all levels to get hostages back, I think that it's unlikely that 50 hostages would be released this week.
Neri and Shira, welcome. I'm relieved that you're able to join, even if your names and titles are not listed on the screen. We know who you are. Neri, I want to bring you in to can you give us, bring us back to the beginning? What exactly does the deal entail? And what, from your vantage point in reporting, were some of the sticking points? And what do you envision being some of the challenges in implementing the deal to its full extent?
Sure. So good to be with you all, even if belatedly. And I'm sure what Michael and Nimrod had to say was very insightful and illuminating. So the deal, as we understand it, it's intricate, it's involved, but basically Israel will be receiving 50 hostages over the course of the coming 4 days or so in daily installments. So around 10 to 12 Israeli hostages will be released every day, and they will be women and children. That's also an important point. So women and children every day being released. And in return, Israel will, or has committed, as of early this morning and late last night, to a 4-day pause in fighting, essentially holding its fire. And Israel will also be releasing 150 Palestinian prisoners, again, women and minors being held in Israeli jails, also in daily installments. And on top of that, Israel has also committed to allow/facilitate the entry into the Gaza Strip of massive amounts of humanitarian aid, by one count, at least 200 trucks daily, if not more, and including fuel. There are also smaller details within the deal. For instance, the overflight of Israeli UAVs over the Gaza Strip will be heavily limited. That will have an impact in terms of the hostage release on the ground. I think Hamas doesn't want them to know exactly where and when it's happening. As well as on the other side, according to Prime Minister Netanyahu, Hamas is also committed to allow the Red Cross to visit and check the remaining hostages, some 180 hostages after the initial 50. And that's not a minor point for Hamas to, in theory, allow Red Cross visits to the remaining hostages. And then a final point, there is the option of extending the deal. So it's initially for 50 Israeli hostages over the course of, we imagine, 4 days. But the option exists for Hamas to extend the agreement, 10 Israeli hostages being released daily in return for 1 day of a ceasefire, up to a total of 10 days. So in total. So this can be extended, beyond the initial 4-day period and beyond the initial 50 hostages being released, but up to a limit of 10 days. So that in total is the details of the deal. And in terms of what can go wrong, a lot, despite the fact that both Israel and Hamas have agreed to it, and despite the Qataris, the Egyptians, and the Biden administration being the mediators / guarantors of it. For instance, what happens if someone opens fire on the ground and Israel returns fire or receives fire? What happens if and when the ceasefire is violated, say maybe not on the first day, but a second day? Secondly, what if Hamas declares that they see Israeli UAVs in the skies above? What happens then? And so on and so forth. We just have to remember that at the end of, towards the end of the 2014 Israel-Hamas war, there was a ceasefire that had been agreed to, and it was violated by Hamas. And that's when a slain Israeli soldier was kidnapped into Gaza, and Israel and Hamas, as one senior Israeli official put it to me a few weeks ago, Israel was negotiating over the bodies of 2 slain IDF soldiers for 10 years. So again, we all hope that this deal is executed properly, is implemented, that as many Israelis are released back home as possible. But again, it's set to begin being implemented tomorrow, Thursday, and so we have to wait and see how the coming days proceed.
Shira, I want to bring you in to talk about how this pause will be utilized and thought, particularly from the humanitarian perspective. Could you say a word about where we're at and what you think the priority will be in utilizing this pause to address the humanitarian needs in Gaza?
Thank you, David. Hi, all. It's good to be here, and I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. Just a moment before we get to humanitarian and the implications, I do think that it's worthy. In Hebrew, we don't use ceasefire. So it's a term that the international community uses, and in English, it's ceasefire. But here, it's definitely not a ceasefire. It's I don't know if you say recess or a lull or something that's much more like in standard war, where you let a humanitarian break. So there's no concept of ceasefire here. There's an assumption that it could be more challenging given international pressure, but Israel is continuing its military campaign. So that's one thing. The second thing, when you talked about what can go wrong, and I don't know, I apologize if I missed something that Michael and Nimrod said, but there is an assumption that Hamas, being expert at this, the first day they will execute and implement as plans, but then they will not find one child. It will take them more time. They will drag this on and on and on and create complexities. And it's not like the deal is just beginning. It's going to be a painful implementation of the deal. So that's another thing. Before I also go to the humanitarian, I think one of the fears of it's a difficult frog to swallow, right? Like, even as I'm totally supportive of the deal, what would Hamas do with the deal? And it would let them reorganize and get a better picture. But I think it's fair to say that also from a military standpoint for the IDF, this break could be helpful before even we go to the humanitarian, getting a better read of the situation, not sending troops back home. And this is not the objective of this, but there could be advantages also from Israel if it remains that temporary. In terms of the humanitarian surge, I think we are hearing that, and especially Hamas is saying that this is going to bring humanitarian relief at unprecedented levels. So there are several issues to this. First of all, the amount of assistance aid that is available now at El Arish in Egypt, where the international community brings stuff. It's higher levels than there were last week. However, it's difficult in terms of which airplanes are allowed to land there, civilian airplanes, not civilian airplanes. There's a bottleneck that starts there. Then there are bottlenecks in terms of the Egyptian processing, Israeli security checks. In a sense, Israel and the Egyptians are working together in ways that were unprecedented on this matter before, but there are bottlenecks there. And I'm not sure if this lull ceasefire will solve all the bottlenecks. What it would make easier is to definitely move inside Gaza. So now there's a humanitarian sort of corridor goes from north to south, and it's open for several hours a day, and it's mostly for people, right, to be able to move south where it's more safe. Now you will allow bringing convoys north. Where most of the population, the vast majority of the population is no longer present, but there's still some people. So in that regard, it will make it easier and more safe when humanitarian assistance go in. And the second part of it, which remains to be seen, is the quantities of fuel which would be allowed in. I know what Hamas is saying. Israel, right until a few days ago, we said no fuel will go in. Now fuel goes in, so this barrier is removed. But there's still a question of quantities. Will fuels just go into essential facilities, desalination plants, sewage treatment plants, bakeries, so we can bake bread, or will it be quantities that we fear a divergence by Hamas, and this is here about just reducing the risk. There's no way to eliminate the risk. So I do think there's an option to improve the humanitarian situation and bring on, but I don't know unless we take collectively as an international community take advantage of this lull to make the humanitarian assistance process more efficient, remove the bottlenecks, and also bring a surge in terms of the quantities of what comes in and the quality. So matching the needs of what's needed in Gaza to what the international community is happening. Then there's an opportunity. But if this goes on only for 4 days, as the deal is now designed, it would be difficult to make a remarkable difference.
Shira, I actually want to stay with you for a second on the considerations of the military, because of course this is a deal with Hamas. What does it mean for the north with Hezbollah? Is there any, clearly this is not a pause that impacts the north as well. Is there an assumption that will continue, or that the conflict there will subside? Is there any thinking about how this might impact the northern arena?
Well, first of all, it can go both ways, right? But I think the good news, and at least this public statements from Hezbollah that we heard, is that they are gonna join the ceasefire. It depends on what happens between now and 10 a.m. local time. We know how the escalatory dynamics. There's still fire going on between Israel and talk about Hezbollah or Hamas in the north, but it should, at least the hope is, and the read at the moment is that it could reduce tensions and bring to de-escalations. I think the Houthis, that there's a different, I don't think that anyone in Israel thought they would be missiles from Yemen or Houthi combatants, militants would take over ships, but this has become a concern now here, and it's less clear if they are part of a ceasefire as well. Probably not.
Yeah, Nimrod, I want to bring you in to ask about the politics of this and the various stages of approval that we saw yesterday, and the hours of meetings, and the various considerations between the far right coming out against the deal and ultimately Smotrich in favor of it. I'm curious what it tells you about the way in which the war cabinet is making decisions and about the shape of Israeli politics going forward.
Well, yeah, we had the required war cabinet session approving, going to the broad cabinet approving, and eventually going to the full government approving. The deliberations in the full cabinet were, as always, in these kinds of parliamentary debate platform. Each minister has to make his statement so he can send it later, leak it later to his constituencies, his or her constituencies. And yeah, Smotrich was a bit of a surprise because just 24 hours later, and even less, he was in one mind with Ben Gvir, and the two of them and their crowd were hostile to the idea of the deal and had very well thought through arguments why this is a bad idea. But eventually he claims that listening to the security establishment analysis and commitment that the pause will not prevent resumption, or as a matter of fact, that there is a determination to resume the operation the morning after the pause, that persuaded him to go for it. Obviously, issues of substance play less in their consideration these days. Both Smotrich and Ben Gvir are preparing themselves for the morning after, not the war in Gaza, but the morning after this government. They see the polls, they see the government collapsing in the polls, the coalition. They're trying to distance themselves, to distinguish themselves, and to reaffirm their base, trying to bite into the more right, hardcore side of Likud and others. So it is sad to say that at such a critical moment in a brutal situation, they play politics.
Yeah. I actually want to bring back Neri because I have a lot of questions that have come in that are sort of grouped in a similar category, which is the questions are about, do we have a full accounting of who will be released? What to do about those that cannot be identified in terms of the location? What does it mean? What is the process by which they can be identified and ultimately released? And who are the Palestinians who are being released on the Israeli side? And I think there's a lot of concern that the narrative that's growing is that this is essentially a hostage exchange where we have innocent women, children, and literally babies being released with those who've been arrested for various offenses on the other side. So I wonder if you could say a word about what does it mean for the remaining hostages, locating them in the next and their future, and a bit about who are these Palestinian prisoners being released?
Okay, so there are different facets to those questions, but hopefully we'll touch on all of them. So big picture, there are around 236 remaining hostages inside Gaza right now, and 50 of them are set to be released over the coming days. Now, we don't yet know who those will be, but we know the amount and the type, i.e. every day it's going to be 10 or 12 people, and they're going to be women and children. Now, in terms of the identities, to the best of our understanding, every night, so i.e. tonight, possibly, Hamas will do an accounting and it will send a list of who is set to be released tomorrow that will eventually reach Israel, and that's how people will know who's actually set to be released. Now, your question is well taken in the sense that Hamas doesn't have all of the hostages. It has the vast majority of them, but Islamic Jihad, the smaller militant group in the Gaza Strip, has around a few dozen hostages, as well as about 20 others are being held by criminal gangs, criminal families, call them what you want. So it's very unclear, say, if Islamic Jihad is holding a woman or a child, whether Hamas will be able to locate them and retrieve them and then release them as part of the agreement. It's still unclear. Hamas told the Qataris it will do its utmost, but there's room for a lot of skepticism in that regard. So that's just in terms of the logistics and the technicalities of finding the hostages. But it is very interesting that Hamas is still able to conduct very involved negotiations from inside Gaza via Egypt and Qatar, 47 days into a war, and it's at least nominally able, and it's going to be tested in the coming days, to retrieve and then deliver a number of Israelis, hopefully every day, to the Red Cross in a given location. So it just goes to show you that in terms of command and control, it's still It's still a functioning organization. I'd argue or believe primarily in southern Gaza, which is where we believed the bulk of the hostages were being held anyway. So that's just in terms of what's happening inside Gaza, inside Israeli prisons. So 150 women and minors. I believe the youngest person being held is 14 years old. So that's what's meant by minors, essentially teenagers. So unlike the Israelis being held captive inside the Gaza Strip, where you have a 10-month-old baby and 3-year-olds and 2-year-olds and 4-year-olds, you have teenagers up to and including 17 and 18-year-olds being held in Israeli prisons. That's what's meant by sometimes referred to as Palestinian children, teenagers and women who have been arrested for security offenses. So everything from attempted terror attacks to, in some cases, likely throwing stones on a West Bank highway and the like. So it varies in terms of the offenses that they're in for, but they're not what's termed in Israel heavy prisoners with Israeli blood on their hands. It is interesting that, to the best of our understanding, the bulk of the prisoners on the Palestinian side set to be released are from the West Bank. So it's not like the majority are from Gaza. You also have East Jerusalemites in there, and I believe a handful of Palestinians who are from Gaza. And according to international law, they're supposed to be released back to their homes. So it begs the question whether the Gazans who are set to be released from Israeli jail will be sent back to Gaza. The West Bankers likely will be sent back to the West Bank. These Jerusalemites, it becomes a bit trickier just in terms of the precise locations of where they're returning to, and some of them actually live next to Israeli citizens who are Jews as well in various kind of East Jerusalem neighborhoods and settlements. But that's essentially what we understand to be the 150 Palestinians who are set to be released as well.
Very helpful. It's amazing. We've received about 25 questions thus far, and so many were about this question of how to reach hostages and the Palestinian identity. Nimrod, you want to make a point, and then I want to bring in another group of questions that we've heard from the audience. But Nimrod, please.
Yeah, to the wealth of information that Neri shared, I'll add a couple of points. One, of the 50, we know that there are 30 children out of the 40 that were abdicated. 8 women who are mothers of 8 of the 30, as well as 12 additional women whose children are not hostages. Our prison system, together with the Shin Bet, the Internal Security, have prepared a list of 300 Palestinian women and minors to be released. And they prepared those 300 for what Neri described earlier, in case Hamas shows up with another 10 hostages post the initial 50. Israel is prepared to extend the ceasefire for another day and another day and another day after that. So there is a list of 300 from which to choose the initial 150 and maybe choose more should the deal progress.
Terrific. Thanks for adding that. I do want to bring in Michael, because there's a group of questions that we've received. One group, as I was mentioning, was really about the identity of the hostages of the nation of the Palestinians. Another group was very clearly about the question of Israel being pressured into a ceasefire, that this pause will ultimately become a growing call for the end to the campaign entirely. And as Secretary Blinken heads to the region, Michael, I wonder if you can comment on how the United States is viewing this pause. Is it something that will be extended? Do you expect growing pressures? And how do you see the international reaction to this pause and assumed resumption of fighting when it concludes?
I absolutely expect growing pressures on Israel to turn this pause into something longer and perhaps something more permanent. And I think it's going to come from a number of directions and for a few reasons. Firstly, assuming that it holds, if you have 4 days where there is no violence and nobody is being killed, that is going to make it very difficult for people to then absorb violence restarting again. And it sort of doesn't matter which party we're talking about. The United States has, of course, given Israel really full backing for its military campaign. But U.S. officials have also been uneasy with the level of Palestinian civilian casualties, and I think they've been uneasy with the slower pace of humanitarian assistance versus what they'd like to see. And so when you have 4 days where presumably assistance will be coming in at a higher rate and where there will be no Palestinian civilian casualties, I think it's going to be difficult, even for the United States, to just accept the idea that after 4 days we're just going to restart and go back to where we were. Not to say that the U.S. is going to tell Israel that it must stop, but I think there is going to be some sort of pressure that is inevitable to at least try to do things differently. And that obviously goes even more so when we talk about the rest of the region, which has been calling for a ceasefire this entire time. Second, Neri alluded to this earlier, I think as a cheer actually, but I fully expect Hamas to play all sorts of games. And so, it's at the end of the 4 days, it's going to be, oh, well, we have another 10 hostages, but maybe we need an extra day to actually locate them because we don't know where they are. And then it's going to be, oh, well, we have another 10, but, we have to compile a much fuller list. So, why don't you give us another day to compile a fuller list? And then it's going to be, oh, maybe we have another 10, but the Red Cross hasn't been able to get to all of them. So maybe we need another day to verify where they are. It's going to be like this. I also expect that, as with past ceasefires, Hamas is probably not going to keep it entirely. Maybe you'll see a rocket go off and they say, oh, it was a mistake. Right? We've seen in the past Hamas shoot rockets, which they say was due to lightning strikes or, renegade cells that they can't control. So I think they're going to be testing this the entire time. And, as they test and they probe, there's going to be pressure on Israel to maintain the quiet. And there's going to be pressure on Israel to give Hamas more time to fulfill the various things for which it has excuses that it wants to do. So that's going to create more pressure as well. And there very well may be pressure domestically within Israel. The scenes of 50 hostages returning safe and sound, presuming that that's what happens, I think is going to create even more of a groundswell to give more opportunities for this to happen. Let's not forget that this is based on the fact that everybody in the cabinet, with the exception of 3 members of Otzma Yehudit, voted for this, including the ministers from Hatzianut Hadatit, religious Zionism, who said beforehand they weren't going to vote for it, and then they did. I think should give everyone a sense of just how popular this presumably is among the Israeli public, and I think that those pressures are going to come as well. So I'm sure that obviously the Israeli government and the IDF are aware of all of these things going in, but I expect, and that's before we even, by the way, get to the pressures domestically within the U.S., which, if you saw the polls last week, where there's still very clear support for Israel, but no longer in some polls majority support to allow Israel to keep on conducting military operations as they have been. Or more support for the U.S. to act as a neutral arbiter, whatever that might mean. So I think there's going to be lots of pressure, and it's going to be difficult for Israel to just pick up again in 4 days, as things have been going up until now.
I want to ask Shira for her reflections on the same question from this perspective of the IDF, as it recognizes. Clearly will recognize the growing pressures that Michael is referencing.
Yes, so there's no question there's going to be pressure, and I think part of the reasons why those objecting the deal, not those who just voted against the deal, right? Those who objected because the same deal was on the table now for 2 weeks. Even more. They can claim that it was marginally improved, but the fact is that those were the basic contours of the deal, and the international pressure and the understanding it would be very difficult to resume operations at the same intensity. This was a key consideration and a key fear, I think. And again, we're talking now, and we haven't even seen the pause yet. That the defense establishment in Israel, as well as the cabinet, they're adamant about continuing where they stopped. I mean, the idea is that, as we've seen the wreckage in Gaza, it's mostly in the northern part of the Strip. Israel bifurcated the north and the south, moving population southward. There's a military, there's an air campaign also in the south, but it's not one that supports the ground invasion. Ground invasion's primarily been in the north. But in a sense, I think this is also where a pause also serves Israel to think about the next step. Right? What about the next step? Is it going for a full ground operation in the south and whatever that means? Because it's not just about eliminating Hamas. It means that almost a million people from the north have moved south. Gaza is a very small area. Now it's half the area. With a population of 2.2 million people, 2.3, very difficult. Where do you move them? Are there any safe places? The north is uninhabitable at the moment, right? It's not like you could just just move north. We'll figure this out. So in a sense, I do think Israel will resume the military campaign because the objective of the war is still eliminating Hamas's governing capabilities and military threat to Israel. It could look different from what it looked in the north. In terms of Michael's point about the public pressure here in Israel, and I think it's only public pressure that brought the IDF and Shin Bet and other organizations to support the deal, right? Because professionally they understand it slows down the fighting. Is the public pressure here that would also brought the Netanyahu to approve it in the cabinet? So that's why it's happening. There's going to be public pressure. However, in terms of the Hamas's play, and they can drag this on for a maximum, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Nimrod, a maximum of 10 days. If it's beyond 10 days, they will have to bring it to the government for another approval. And that would look very different. And then you will not have, I think, such a strong support on the part of, Mossad, Shin Bet, IDF, and that'd be harder for Netanyahu to push this forward. So that's why I think the campaign will continue despite the pressure, but we can talk in 10 days.
Nimrod, I want to bring you in. We have a question about the impact of this deal on Palestinian politics, on the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Does this lead to greater support for Hamas, as yet again sort of proving that their violent means have led to a prisoner release? What is the implication on this, on the state of the Palestinian arena?
Before that, I would like to add my nickel to the previous question, if I may, because I believe that the time gained from the moment that the deal was on the table, as Shira said, a couple of weeks, until the moment it was approved, provided the IDF with the opportunity to reach much of its objective in the north, including surrounding, not yet penetrating, but surrounding the last remaining 3 strongholds of Hamas in the north, which by IDF judgment, that is a matter of days, not cleaning up every single operative, but basically taking over those 3 neighborhoods. I think that in any event, whether there was a pause, humanitarian pause as a result of hostage deal or not, the IDF MO going south would have been very, very different. And we heard it from the IDF over the last few days, the days preceding the deal, where the premise was that it will not be such huge formations moving in, but rather a smaller formations, different MO. The issue of the population, they have answers to, and more targeted and less comprehensive, both in terms of damage and everything else. So there are those in the IDF, while cognizant of all the downsides that Shira has enumerated, that believe that reorganizing for the second phase of the military campaign, which should look differently, helps the IDF as well. On the West Bank, popularity of Hamas shoots through the roof, primarily among the young, not surprisingly. The fact that Hamas is forcing Israel into yet another prisoner deal will probably show up in the polls in the next few days as well. And if that was not bad enough, if that injection into belligerent mood was not bad enough, while all eyes are on Gaza and on the Lebanese border, settlers go wild in the West Bank. We just saw a summary of assaults during the war. The numbers are staggering. And I would say that if there is no effort to change course on the West Bank, perhaps by the time this war ends, we will be less worried about Gaza than we are on the West Bank.
Neri, I want to bring you in. Let's say I have a basket of questions that are all about the political future and what might be with the far right and its opposition to this deal. And as Netanyahu's navigating pressure, will the far right actually lead to potentially bringing down the government? I want your thoughts on that. But I also want you to comment on the nature of the deal, because there's another group of questions that is questioning the 3 Palestinians released for every one Israeli, and whether, how does Israel break the cycle of essentially providing a blueprint for getting prisoners released by taking individuals hostage, and what sort of pressures there is inside Israeli public around the nature of this deal, given that circumstance.
Sure. So it's a nice. Those questions are nice segues to what I actually wanted to talk about, which was piggybacking on. But it is tied. It is tied both to domestic politics and the campaign, the war.
Yeah.
Look, 3 Palestinians for every Israeli. That's an improvement. Just have to remember the 2011 Gilad Shalit deal. It was 1 Israeli for over 1,000 Palestinians. So that might be movement in a more positive direction. And in terms of the politics behind the deal and the far right, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of public pressure and support for this particular deal. Now that I think that's true, and there's a reason why someone like Bezalel Smotrich flip-flopped and eventually supported the deal after he said he would vote against. But public pressure cuts both ways. If you had a deal, say, maybe not all the hostages for all the Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jail, that's over 6,000 or 7,000, but something that would release major amounts of Palestinians, and not just women and minors, but also convicted terrorists with blood on their hands, the politics of that kind of deal would be very different. Not just amongst the far right, but even amongst the Likud and maybe even beyond the Likud, publicly. The issue too of the return of women and children from the Israeli point of view is also significant, and again the release of Palestinian women and children. So again, public pressure can cut both ways, and I think part of the reason why this government and the public at large supports this deal is that it's a limited deal. It's a limited deal in terms of the amount of Palestinians being released. It's also limited in terms of time. And so if you had something, say, broader and more significant, I think that would be a different proposition, precisely due to the fact that, as Shira mentioned, the goals of the war from the Israeli point of view haven't been met, right? Not all the hostages have been returned. Hamas has not been destroyed as both a military and governing force in the Gaza Strip. And so the public intuitively understands that, but is willing to wait 4 or 5 days until you get back to those to fulfilling those objectives. If that's taken away, the future of this government may not be long for the world. In other words, the public, I think, writ large, would not support a ceasefire, would not support an end to the war, even if Hamas considered releasing all the hostages. And again, what the price for that would be is open to speculation. I would just say the final point, big picture, if we zoom out and not just focus on this particular deal, but the reasons why Israel and really Hamas accepted this deal, the reasons for Israel I just laid out. The reasons for Hamas, this has been true since the first day of the war, and it's even more true now. Hamas and its leader in Gaza, Yahya Sinwar, is playing for time. It's playing for time. that he believes at a certain point, either the international community or the Israeli public, or both, will force the government to stop. That's essentially his way or his strategy for winning the war. Now, international legitimacy, it doesn't hurt him if he releases all the kids and the women, right? Then he can say, well, we're not the barbarians that slaughtered women and children and babies on October 7th. Look at the humanitarian gesture we just gave. You can take down the pictures in Times Square and all across the world in Israel of the kids and the women. So it doesn't hurt him in terms of international legitimacy. Also, the issue of stopping the fighting and then restarting the fighting is a legitimate one internationally, less so in Israel, but also Israeli politics. That we don't quite know how the scenes of parents being reunited with their children or families being reunited with their loved ones, again, women and children, will play amongst the remaining hostage families and their loved ones in Israel. That it may actually just increase the pressure on the government to cut any deal at any price to get everybody back. And that's why I think Sinwar offered this deal at this moment in time, or maybe a week ago. It serves a strategy.
Yeah, important points. Thanks for raising that. Listen, we have like 10 minutes, and I think that I'd love to actually turn to each of you for some concluding thoughts. It strikes me that we all got together 2 days after the attacks on October 7th, filled with enormous questions. We had a webinar then in which we discussed the attacks and all of the questions that were to come. We're now meeting a month and a half later. We have a lot of lessons learned. We have a lot of reflections from this moment, and also questions moving forward. And I wonder if I could invite you each to speak a bit about what are the issues that you think have not been, that have been overlooked, or the questions that you have going forward, or the issues that you think that Americans in particular must be identifying and recognizing as we head into what in some way, shape, or form will be the next phase of this war. And Michael, I want to start with you.
I'll focus on the American side of this. And there I'd say there are two things. First, within Israel, there's all sorts of recognition that all sorts of opposition to Prime Minister Netanyahu. Not so many calls to replace him in the middle of a war, but certainly I think a lot of frustration that he hasn't been willing to take responsibility, and I think a lot of frustration as to how he's behaved. And the five of us were all together last week in Israel for a few days, and I think we heard that in spades. But I think that what's a little less appreciated is that for the United States, that is trying to marshal all sorts of things in the region, whether it be the humanitarian assistance or working on the day after. I think it's difficult to do that with Netanyahu still around, because it isn't just an issue of what he's necessarily doing inside of Israel. Lots of things that he's doing are with an eye toward his, in my view, non-existent political future. And if you're the United States and you're trying to figure out what the aftermath in Gaza should look like, very hard to do that when you've got somebody who isn't necessarily thinking about what should happen from a policy perspective, but is thinking more about what should happen from a political perspective. And so I think that it isn't just Israelis who are upset at the moment with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think that within the United States, there's a fair degree of frustration as well for anybody who's working on trying to move forward. That it's difficult without figuring out what the next Israeli government is going to look like, because it will look different, and there's so much uncertainty about when that will be. I think it makes any type of post-war planning tough. Second, there's within the American Jewish community, there's been this enormous amount of solidarity for Israel. We saw it most prominently last Tuesday with 300,000 people or 290,000 people showing up in DC for a rally against anti-Semitism, but much more in support of Israel. And I think that particularly if if at this point we're entering a new phase of the war, that's going to change a lot of things on the ground in Israel. It won't necessarily change a lot of things on the ground in the United States, where anti-Semitism has been on the rise as a result of all sorts of things. And I think that the American Jewish community that so far has really stood more or less united in terms of what it wants to see and its backing of Israel, not universally, of course, but I think largely. I think that's going to become a bit more difficult as things shift in Israel, as the phase of the war changes, as you have what I think we all expect will be pretty large protests against the government when kind of the main ground operation in Gaza ends. And so, that's something as well that I think isn't necessarily, people aren't necessarily looking that far into the future here in the United States within the Jewish community, but I think we should be, because it's very easy to stand in support of Israel when it seems as if Israel is unified and moving in a common direction. But I think that unity in Israel in many ways really is illusory. And when it breaks apart, it's going to have a real impact back here within the American Jewish community as well.
I'm going to do around the horn, going from Neri, Nimrod, and we'll end with Shira. Neri, your thoughts?
Sure. I agree with everything Michael says, not surprisingly. I'll just add 2 points for people looking from the outside in. I'll repeat what I said and emphasize it. You have to kind of appreciate more than maybe people do the domestic politics behind the war. In other words, that this is, like people say, October 7th changed everything. I think it did change everything, and I don't think this government or any government can just stop the campaign as it's been laid out to at least eliminate the Hamas threat from the Gaza Strip. That this government and likely subsequent governments won't be able to survive unless they move to accomplish that goal. And I can get into details, but I'll just leave it at that. The second thing people should more appreciate from the outside looking in, with all due respect to the Gaza Strip, the north, the Israel-Lebanon border, is more a concern to me just in terms of the escalation potential, and not enough attention is being shown on that frontier, diplomatically and also regionally, and that it's not just an issue of cross-border fire between Israel and Hezbollah, which is Hezbollah started from October 7th onwards, but that tens of thousands of Israelis have been evacuated, essentially displaced from their northern border communities, and will not agree to go back unless the threat from Hezbollah across the border is taken care of, either diplomatically or militarily. That's become an issue of sovereignty and at bottom Zionism, and that this government or any future government won't just be able to go back to business as usual on the northern border as well. And that's a major concern that needs more attention.
So, Nimrod, I'll ask you to give a brief remarks, and then we'll close out with Shira.
At the risk of groupthink, I agree with Michael and Neri. And the only point I want to make has to do with the flip side of Michael's first point. My headline is "Stuck in Jerusalem." When you have a situation that a large part of the public doesn't trust the prime minister's judgment and suspects that he has conflict of interest in conducting the war, that he has an interest in extending the war because his future depends on postponing certain processes and diluting certain processes. When everybody who is working on the morning after in Gaza, assuming we reach a morning after one day, assumes that it has to involve the PA one way or another, after rejuvenated, after strengthened and so on, and the prime minister will prevent that. And if he prevents that no third party will contribute to the morning after in Gaza. Not regional players, not international players will not contribute to that. If that is not to happen, American strategy of building a broad coalition to block Iran, a very powerful one, including normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. All that will lay in ruins, and all that is stuck in Jerusalem.
Thank you, Nimrod. Shira.
In no particular order, but I'll say Neri spoke about, Lebanon and the front. I will say that the West Bank is teetering on the brink in ways that are more dangerous than we had thought. And Michael and David, you were in Israel, and you've heard this from various people. And I think this is the second front that we might be seeing, not Lebanon. Sitting here, I will just say that I think if there's something that I learned from October 7th is that we all need to have some humility, right? Systems here have failed miserably, and I'm not sure this humility is sensed across different levels in Israel in terms of what Israel can achieve and not achieve, not just the military objectives, but what does it mean for the future of UNRWA and the UN and the Middle East. And I think this should be a voice coming also from the outside and just sort of explaining the bigger context of this. There's a misunderstanding in Israel of what the world sees. Michael, the pressures you spoke about, what it means for Americans, even the American Jews, and what Israelis sees. You saw here, David and Michael, Israelis are still identifying their dead. That's a nation in mourning. Everyone is in pain, but that's not what the world sees. The world sees babies in incubators, Palestinian babies dying, and there's really someone has to create this dialogue in terms of the different realities, because it's very difficult to diverge to bridge this gap. I'll just say final thing is that I think this is where the role of think tanks and other organizations come in. I think it's incumbent on all of us to ask leaders, including in Israel and in the US, to put some content into their words. So when Israel says the outcome in Gaza would be no Hamas, no chaos, no military occupation, and now no PA. So what, yes, like play this out for us. But I think it also goes to the Biden administration, who came up with a very creative term, revitalized PA. In Israel, it's now RPA. It's not PA, RPA. And the translation is very different. It's other, different, new. But what does it actually mean? And connecting sort of this long-term vision into the short-term objectives, and clarifying that absent a vision, it will be very difficult to both achieve the military objectives and get the international support and bring the humanitarian relief. So I'll end with that.
That is just a tremendous close, and it reflects on the enormous, complex, and challenging agenda that has faced not only the state of Israel, but the United States in navigating its leadership in the region through this period of time. And I think it's incumbent on us and on you all on this webinar to help us put some content into the ideas for how do we move forward. And I am very grateful for you all for your expertise and your jumping on this webinar, and wishing you all a happy Thanksgiving, even those in Israel. I hope you have a chance to eat some turkey. Thank you all for joining us. We will continue this conversation in the days and weeks to come, and hope you'll all continue to turn to Israel Policy Forum and hear Neri's analysis on our podcast, and welcome those who are not yet supporters of our work to become supporters at israelpolicyforum.org. And until next time, happy Thanksgiving to you all, and wishing you all a nice, safe, and enjoyable holiday.